So yesterday's video got me to really dig deeper into my philosophical political science foundations. I pulled out this because originally I thought I would find what I was looking for in this. So for those of you who aren't familiar, John Stuart Mill, a lot of American definitions on free speech are from this text. If you just read this from John Stuart Mill, you're scratching at such a surface of how much influence he's had on society. John Stuart Mill is what's called a utilitarian. Utilitarianism is a philosophy based on maximizing utility. So now we have to define what utility is. As utilitarianism evolved, the word happiness started becoming more and more associated with it. And for those of you who've seen my previous video, now you probably are a little bit more privy to why I decided to do this video. Because in my last video, at the end, I said,
some of you watching would be like, there's a big one that I think our modern society cares a lot about that we haven't even looked at. What do you think that is, guys? Happiness, right? None of these systems put the word happiness or whatever proxy for it into it, but that's something in modern day we really care about, and maybe it was always the case.
To define happiness is also above my pay grade. There's entire books, entire disciplines even devoted to the study of happiness. Positive psychology, for example, comes to mind. But the reason I sought out Mill is he at least gives a little guide as to some of the things to think about. So I'm going to read to you guys something that inspired this talk that actually made me to dig deeper into his grand book called Utilitarianism. When I first learned about John Stuart Mill in Professor Tan's class, by the way, shout out Professor Tan, he gave us this passage and a lot of other stuff, but this passage gave me some things to think about because prior to this, I think my concept and understanding of utilitarianism was much more Benthamite, I believe is the right word. Jeremy Bentham is the guy who you usually think of besides John Stuart Mill when you think about utilitarianism. Mill gives us a distinction to think about, and I will put this into context, but let me first show you guys the quote that kind of inspired me to think. This is quoted a lot when people think about Mill and utilitarianism. It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig are a different opinion, it is because they only know their own side of the question. The other party to the comparison knows both sides. It really resonated with me. You could argue this is partly because I am a little on the spectrum. For those of you who don't know, I'm on the autism spectrum. But from a young age, my interests were different. Even in college, I could see that I was a little different than a lot of my peers. A lot of my peers, let's go get drunk, let's go hook up. Me, let's enjoy music, let's enjoy discussion. One of the things that always made me happy, getting a veil lifted off something that you previously didn't understand. I remember one of my happiest classes, shout out my friend Ashvin, being in a kind of history, political science type of class and having great discussion with friends. That's why Ashvin and I stayed friends for so many years. We had similar, you could say, definitions of well-being or definitions of happiness. Long story short, I never really read into, this is chapter 2, the second book or the second essay in John Stuart Mill's Utilitarianism. So I wanted to frame this more into context and maybe we can all explore it more. This is way more than I explored in college, but I think it's necessary. The first thing I'm going to read is actually something that occurs later, but I think this is actually a good entry point because one of the things that you'll hear a lot associated with John Stuart Mill is higher pleasures versus lower pleasures. What exactly are higher pleasures? And this passage that's actually from later on in this chapter is actually a great little intro point. So let's start here. Next to selfishness, the principal cause which makes life unsatisfactory is want of mental cultivation. A cultivated mind, I do not mean that of a philosopher, but any mind to which the fountains of knowledge have been opened and which have been taught in any tolerable degree to exercise its faculties, find sources of inexhaustible interest in all that surrounds it. In the objects of nature, the achievements of art, the imaginations of poetry, the incidents of history, the ways of mankind, past and present, and their prospects in the future. It is possible indeed to become indifferent to all this, and that too without having exhausted a thousandth part of it, but only when one has had from the beginning no moral or human interest in these things and has sought in them only the gratification of curiosity. Now, there is absolutely no reason in the nature of things why an amount of mental culture sufficient to give an intelligent interest in these objects of contemplation should not be the inheritance of everyone born in a civilized society. I think if you just really sit down and read John Stuart Mill, you're going to realize he's not too hard to understand. Yes, he uses big words, but compared to some of the other people, and I think Kant comes to mind, maybe even Hume comes to mind. Actually, Hume's pretty easy to read, but some of the other philosophers, it's really hard to read. John Stuart Mill isn't too hard to read. When I first learned about Mill's interpretation of the higher pleasures versus the lower pleasures, I never actually read this is almost like a definition of what he's saying a higher pleasure is. I just kind of assumed that I was correct. I was like, okay, well, what are higher pleasures not? Well, higher pleasures are not the things that I see a lot on campus that I was disappointed in, right? So now that we've read this, let's then go back to that famous paragraph that has that pig thing. Whoever supposes that this preference takes place at a sacrifice of happiness, that the superior being in anything like equal circumstances is not happier than the inferior, confounds the two very different ideas of happiness and content. It is indisputable that the being whose capacities of enjoyment are low has the greatest chance of having them fully satisfied. And a highly endowed being will always feel that any happiness which he can look for, as the world is constituted, is imperfect. But he can learn to bear its imperfections if they are at all bearable, and they will not make him envy the being who is indeed unconscious of the imperfections, but only because he feels not at all the good which those imperfections qualify. It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig are a different opinion, it is because they only know their own side of the question. The other party to the comparison knows both sides. One thing to keep in mind, and I think I knew this when I first read Mill back in college, it's worth emphasizing that Mill is probably what you would call normative. Normative just means what things should be, what things ought to be. So he's not describing society. I'm sure any of you listening to this video would say, how many people in this world are truly the ones that care about the higher pleasures? And if they could compare the higher versus the lower, they would go for the higher. I thought of myself as one of those people. Some of it might have come down to genetics. Some of it might have come down to upbringing. You can see from what we've read of Mill, a lot of this stuff can't be separated from culture, from society. How utilitarian a society is will dictate whether we see some of this normative stuff that Mill's advocating. Besides my friend Ashvin, I think the next time I felt like I really met a fellow Mill type of higher pleasure friend was when I met my friend Matthew. Now, Matthew and I met in different circumstances because Matthew and I met at a summer program, and we actually slowly bonded after I became a Christian. What's interesting about Matthew is in 2018, I sat down with him. For him, he grew up Christian, and he actually even went to seminary school. And so I was curious whether his upbringing, the culture he grew up in, would get him to feel certain ways about the lower pleasures versus the higher pleasures. One of the things I told Matthew was, when I grew up, I never felt like the point of a man is to ride everything that moved, right? For lack of a better word. I'm trying to use euphemisms. And one of the other things I told him was I never was too horny in high school. And Matthew confirmed. He told me he wasn't either. I think both of us agreed that part of that reason was, I don't know if Matthew was ever exposed to pornography, but I didn't get exposed to it until college. So that was a moment where I realized prior to our mass information, quick consumption, lots of stimulation type of society, Maybe it was easier to achieve this type of normative way of being a human being. But whatever the case, wherever you stand on this, let's read more Mill, because he does mention a little bit about this. So John Stuart Mill says, it may be objected that many who are capable of the higher pleasures occasionally, under the influence of temptation, postpone them to the lower. But this is quite compatible with a full appreciation of the intrinsic superiority of the higher. Men often, from infirmity of character, make their election for the nearer good, though they know it to be less valuable, and this no less when the choice is between two bodily pleasures than when it is between bodily and mental. They pursue sensual indulgences to the injury of health, though perfectly aware that health is the greater good. It may be further objected that many who begin with youthful enthusiasm for everything noble, as they advance in years, sink into indolence and selfishness. But I do not believe that those who undergo this very common change voluntarily choose the lower description of pleasures in preference to the higher. I believe that before they devote themselves exclusively to the one, they have already become incapable of the other. Capacity for the nobler feelings is in most natures a very tender plant, easily killed, not only by hostile influences, but by mere want of sustenance, and in the majority of young persons it speedily dies away if the occupations to which their position in life has devoted them, and the society into which has thrown them, are not favorable to keeping that higher capacity in exercise. Men lose their higher aspirations as they lose their intellectual tastes, because they have not time or opportunity for indulging them, and they addict themselves to inferior pleasures, not because they deliberately prefer them, but because they are either the only ones to which they have access or the only ones which they are any longer capable of enjoying. It may be questioned whether anyone who has remained equally susceptible to both classes of pleasures ever knowingly and calmly preferred the lower, though many in all ages have broken down in an ineffectual attempt to combine both. So long story short, I think this is a very good argument in be careful who you surround yourself with. I think growing up, I felt more and more disconnected towards some of the friends I had in middle school, because they were just the type who was just dick jokes and, oh, let's get together and drink, let's watch movies. You could never have any sort of intelligent discussion with them. And I can imagine applying what John Stuart Mill says. If the entire society surrounding me was that, maybe I would give in too, right? That's one of the reasons why I think all of us are surprised that Professor Jiang is teaching a lot of this stuff in China. Whenever I'm in China, I feel like people know how to live there, and community, family, etc. is tight there. But this type of true intellectual discourse, I don't think I'm going to be able to have as much. And people in China, correct me if I'm wrong. And every time I think about that, I never feel like it's right for me to live in China. My mind, knowing how much I value the higher pleasures, it never wants to be in a situation where there's neither time nor opportunity to indulge in the higher pleasures. Now, I'm not saying this is the right way to live, right? Some people are like, well, friendships are more important. So if my friends don't want to indulge in the higher pleasures, then I'm not leaving my friends. But then this goes into another can of worms, which is worth another discussion another time. But what are friends? What should you look for in friends, right? When are friends not your friends anymore? I don't have the answers. I don't even claim to understand John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism too well. But I just want to use this as an opportunity for us to think. Because John Stuart Mill is a foundation for Western ideology, Western philosophy. And I think all of us are seeing something wrong right now with the West. No matter what side of the trichotomy, shout out the users who told me about the political trichotomy. No matter what side of the political trichotomy you are, I think we see that something's off with the West. As a humanities person, what I would recommend and what I'm doing is, well, let's go into the foundations of the West and try to understand it even better if we haven't understood it. And once we understand it better, then let's diagnose what's wrong, right? We got to start with the first principles. How can we diagnose what's wrong if we don't even know what the foundations are? That's what I give Professor Jiang Xueqin a lot of credit for. Whether I agree with him or not, he's at least getting me to really think and examine again. Why did I study philosophy? Why did I study political science? Why did I study economics? Why did I study psychology? Why should all of you read up on this stuff? It's because we live in a society that requires us to know this stuff. If you're not an informed citizen, you might as well surrender yourself to an authoritarian and hope it's benevolent authoritarianism. I look forward to a lively discussion. I'm going to send this to Professor Tan too and see if Professor Tan can have things to say or guidance for me, / maybe I can even interview Professor Tan. I loved his class. His class was the most intellectually engaging class. We'll definitely have more videos like this, but I'm going to take a slight break. I'm actually going to travel to a wedding soon. We will talk after I get back from the wedding. Thank you guys so much. To be continued. A lot more to think about. Keep learning, guys. Keep learning.